I mentioned earlier that at a certain point in Israel's history, the parts of the Bible coalesced into certain identifiable documents. These documents no longer exist because we just have the Bible arranged in the book form that we have it now. So in this segment, I want to address first of all, why people believe that the Bible originally existed in documents, why this is important, and give you some hints to identify some of the important documents, particularly of the first few books of the Bible. First of all, why do we think that these documents actually existed at some point? The theory that they existed is known as the documentary hypothesis, and notice the word hypothesis. This is not anything that anybody could really ever prove unless they actually dug up some clay tablets that contained these documents, but they don't exist, so it necessarily remains a hypothesis, although it is a very commonly and strongly held hypothesis. I think the likelihood that something like this existed in ancient Israel is somewhere about 90-95%, and I'll explain why in a few moments. Why do we think these documents exist? The reason is because scholars really for hundreds of years have looked at these documents and have noticed certain patterns. First pattern they notice is that certain parts of the Bible use different kinds of vocabulary than other parts of the Bible. The most blatant example of this is that there are two entirely different names of God in Genesis 1, the seven-day creation story, which is thought to come from one document, and Genesis 2 through 3, which is thought to come from a different document. So we have entirely different names of God. Secondly, we have what are called doublets, which are accounts, stories that are so similar that it cannot be a coincidence. But they're different enough that they seem to occur in different places. So we have repeats of biblical stories that will suggest to us that they maybe are two different versions that emerged in different areas that were included in different documents. For instance, we have three distinct documents that describe one of the patriarchs of Israel, Abraham in two cases, Isaac in another, who goes to a foreign country and says that his wife is his sister, and she in turn is taken by the local men of the community, and then God intervenes and she's rescued. So, the details are too similar for it to be a different story. So it appears that they cropped up in different stories, and in the final editing they were put together. Also, probably more interesting for our purposes is different parts of the Bible seem to share a common theology, which common theology differs from that of other documents. So we have different vocabulary, we have different versions of the same story, and we have different theology. So the theory emerged that most likely explains this phenomenon, different vocabulary, different accounts of the story and different theologies, is that they came from distinct sources or documents which existed, which were written, which were assembled at distinct times. And really, in terms of these documents, for our class, I only want you to be familiar with two of these documents. And they represent most fully Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2 and 3. Genesis 2 and 3 I want to talk about first. That's understood to come from a figure that we have named in the 20th and 21st century the Yahwist. That's Y-A-H-W-I-S-T. The reason we call him the Yahwist is because his favorite name for God is Yahweh. And whenever he refers to God, he always refers to him by this proper name, Yahweh. So the Yahwist wrote Genesis 2 and 3, and they portray God in a dramatically different way than we find in Genesis 1, which is thought to come from a writer that we describe as the priestly writer. We believe that Genesis 1 was written very late, probably one of the last parts of the Pentateuch or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible to be written, as kind of an introduction to the whole. And it was written by a community of priests who had resettled in Jerusalem after the conquest, or something around the 5th or the 4th century. And the priestly writer portrays God in a very distant and abstract and a powerful way, whereas the Yahwist in Genesis 2-3, for instance, portrays God in a very human way, as a God who comes down to the garden in the cool of the day when it's most comfortable, and when he can't find his friends, the Adam and Eve, he looks around and he says, "Where are you?" And when he forms Adam a little bit earlier in chapter 2, he forms him like a potter forms clay, and he breathes into his mouth, so his lips to Adam's lips. Whereas the creation in the first time, God just speaks, and they're created. So I want you to be familiar with both the priestly source and the Yahwist source as we go through the chapters of Genesis and beyond. And one other thing I want to say is that there are two ways that these documents are edited into the books that we now know of as Genesis through Deuteronomy. The first way is simply they'll do a whole big block from one document, such as Genesis 1, and then a whole big block from another document. In this case, it'd be Genesis 2 through, I think, 5, and then they'll go back to the priestly writer. So they just kind of interweave them. The other way, which is, depending on your temperament, more confusing or more interesting, is where some final editor, probably the priestly writer, interwove his writing, we do think it was probably a male, with the earlier writing in such a way that there'll be a few verses of one, a few verses of another, and the account of Noah's flood is a case in point of that, where in one sentence it says that he collected 7 animals, in another sentence it says he collected 2 of each, in one sentence it says 40 days, in another place it says a different amount of time, and it seems to be an interwoven document. I actually had a student, second-year student, who just as a project for me tried to divide out the priestly from the Yahwist in the flood story, and without any Hebrew and without any previous training was able to do it quite well.